Chapter 2: The Bolsheviks: From Ideological Conflict to Civil War. The Russian Revolution and the Dialectic of Saturn. In Khrushchev's eyes, Stalin was guilty of horrendous crimes, to the detriment of his own party comrades, deviating from the high road of Leninism and Bolshevism and betraying the ideals of socialism. However, it is precisely the reciprocal accusation of betrayal that, by stimulating or deepening the internal divisions within the same leading group that was the protagonist of October 1917, contributes significantly to the tragedies that befell Soviet Russia. How to explain these splits? The dialectic on the basis of which Saturn devours his children is certainly not an exclusive characteristic of the October Revolution. The choral unity that presides over the overthrow of an ancient regime, now disliked by the majority of the population, inevitably cracks or disappears when it comes to deciding on the new order to be built. This also applied to the English Revolution and the American Revolution. But this dialectic manifested itself in Russia in a particularly violent and prolonged way. Already at the moment of collapse of the Tsarist autocracy, while attempts at monarchical restoration or the establishment of a military dictatorship followed one another, within the ranks of those who were determined to avoid a return to the past, there were nonetheless painful choices to be made. Should they commit oneself first and foremost to peace, or, as the Mensheviks thought, maintain or even expand the war effort, stirring up support now in Russia as well for democratic interventionism? The victory of the Bolsheviks certainly does not put an end to Saturn's dialectic, which, on the contrary, becomes even more bitter. Lenin's call for the conquest of power and for the socialist transformation of the revolution appears as an intolerable deviation from Marxism in the eyes of Kamenev and Zinoviev, who make the Mensheviks aware of the situation and thus attract in turn the accusation of betrayal launched by the majority of the Bolshevik Party. It is a debate that goes beyond the borders of Russia and of the communist movement itself. The Social Democrats are the first to cry out in rage at the abandonment of orthodoxy, which excluded the socialist revolution in a country that had not yet gone through full capitalist development. While Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg are on the side of condemning the Leninist acceptance of the slogan "Land to the Peasants" as an abandonment of the path to socialism. But here we should concentrate on the divisions that occurred within the Bolshevik leadership proper, explaining the particularly devastating force that the dialectic of Saturn assumes are the messianic expectations aroused by an interweaving of circumstances, objective and subjective. There was a universally diffused dismay and indignation at the immense carnage and the configuration of different states in struggle in World War I as bloodthirsty Molochs, determined to sacrifice millions and millions of people on the altar of the defense of the homeland, hiding the real motives of imperialistic competition for world hegemony. This stimulated the push for a totally new political social order. It was a question of cutting once and for all the roots of the horrors that had been manifested since 1914. Further fueled by a worldview which, with Marx and Engels, seems to invoke a future devoid of national borders, mercantile relations, state apparatus, and even juridical coercion, and by an almost religious relationship with the texts of the founding fathers of the communist movement, this claim cannot fail to be disappointed as the construction of the new order begins to take shape. This is why, long before it burst into the center of Trotsky's reflection and denunciation, after having already appeared at the moment of the collapse of the Tsarist autocracy, the motif of the revolution betrayed accompanied the history that began with the rise of the power of the Bolsheviks like a shadow. The accusation or suspicion of betrayal emerged at every turning point of this particularly torturous revolution, pushed by the needs of government action to rethink certain original utopian motives, and still forced to limit its great ambitions within the extreme difficulty of the objective situation. The first challenge faced by the new power was represented by the disintegration of the state apparatus and by the spread of an irreducible anarchism among the peasants, still beyond any state and national vision, therefore substantially indifferent to the drama of the cities deprived of food and resources. And inclined to found ephemeral peasant republics, the same occurred among the deserters, now averse to any discipline, as is confirmed by the emergence in a district of Bessarabia of a free republic of deserters. In this case, they branded Trotsky as a traitor, who, as a leader of the army, was in the front line in the work of re-establishing central power and the very principle of the state. Here there were peasants, the deserters, among whom there is no shortage from the Red Army, and the displaced invoking true socialism and true Soviets, lamenting Lenin who had endorsed or stimulated the revolt against state power, and identifying Trotsky and Jews as vulgar usurpers. The usurping of the sailors of Kronstadt in 1921 can be inserted in the same context. Apparently, on that occasion, Stalin pronounced himself in favor of a more cautious approach, waiting for the besieged fortress to run out of food and fuel. But in a situation in which the dangers of the internal civil war and the intervention of counter-revolutionary powers had not yet disappeared, the immediate military solution ended up being imposed. And again, to be branded as a supporter of the bureaucratic organization, dictator, and ultimately traitor to the original spirit of the revolution is the gendarme, or rather Marshal Trotsky. The latter, in turn, suspected Zinoviev of having fueled for weeks the agitation that led to the revolt, demagogically waving the flag of workers' democracy as in 1917. As we can see, the first accusation of treason marks the passage inevitable in every revolution, but all the more painful in a revolution that broke out in the name of the extinction of the state, from the moment of the overthrow of the old regime to the construction of the new order, from the libertarian phase to the authoritarian one. And, of course, the accusation or suspicion of treason is intertwined with personal ambitions and the struggle for power. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs will close up shop. The patriotic rhetoric and national hatreds, partly spontaneous and in part cleverly stirred up, had resulted in the slaughter of imperialist war. The need to put an end to all this appeared urgent. Thus emerged in certain sectors the communist movement, a completely unrealistic internationalism which tended to dismiss the different national identities as mere prejudice. Let us see in what terms, at the beginning of 1918, Bukharin opposed not only the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, but any attempt by Soviet power to use the contradictions between the various imperialist powers, making agreements or compromises with one or the other. What are we doing? We are turning the party into a dung heap. We always said that sooner or later the Russian Revolution would clash with international capital. That moment has come. Bukharin's disappointment and discomfort are well understood. About 2 years earlier, he had contrasted the war to the death between the great capitalist powers and between the various nation-states and the chauvinistic turn of social democracy with the prospect of a humanity finally unified and united thanks to the social revolution of the international proletariat which overthrows the dictatorship of finance capital with an armed hand, with the socialist epigons of Marxism, responsible for having forgotten or obscured the well-known thesis of the Communist Manifesto, according to which the workers have no fatherland. Defeated along with the bourgeoisie, the last limitation of the proletariat's philosophy is being overcome. Its clinging to the narrowness of the national state, its patriotism. This power advances the slogan of abolishing state boundaries and merging all the peoples into one socialist family. This is not the illusion of a single personality. In assuming the post of People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Trotsky had declared, "I will issue a few revolutionary proclamations to the peoples of the world. Then I will close up shop." With the advent on the ruins of the war, on the wave of the world revolution, of a unified humanity on a planetary level, the first ministry to prove superfluous would be the one that normally presides over the relations between the different states. Compared to this exciting prospect, how mediocre and degenerate the reality in the political project highlighted by the Brest-Litovsk negotiations appeared. With the reemergence of state and national borders and the reappearance, even of return, of the state's reason for existence, not a few Bolshevik militants and leaders experienced this event as the collapse, indeed, as the cowardly and treacherous abandonment of an entire world of ideals and hopes. Certainly, it was not easy to resist the army of Wilhelm II, but to yield to German imperialism only because the Russian peasants, meanly attached to their interests and oblivious to the task imposed by the world revolution, refused to continue to fight. Was this not proof of the incipient peasant degeneration of our party and of Soviet power? At the end of 1924, Bukharin describes the spiritual climate at the time of Brest-Litov that was dominant among the left communists, pure-blooded, and the circles of Comrade Trotsky sympathizers that sympathized with the Comrade Trotsky. In particular, he pointed out Comrade Rizanov, who then left the party because we had, as it were, lost our proletarian innocence. Beyond individual personalities, it was important party organizations that declared, in the interest of the world revolution, we consider it expedient to accept the possibility of losing Soviet power, which is now becoming purely formal. These words were strange and monstrous to Lenin, who, however, at a certain moment was the subject of these accusations or suspicions of betrayal, and seemed to be the target of a project, albeit vague, of a coup d'etat, which Bukharin was considering. All the prestige and energy of the great revolutionary leader was needed to overcome the crisis. However, it reappeared a few years later. With the defeat of the Central Empires and the breakout of the revolution in Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and its overbearing appearance in other countries, the perspective from which the Bolsheviks had been forced to take leave in Brest-Litov seemed to regain new vitality and relevance. In concluding the first Congress of the Communist International, Lenin himself declared, "The victory of the proletarian revolution on a world scale is assured. The founding of an international Soviet republic is on the way." Thus, the imminent defeat of capitalism on a world scale would quickly be followed by the fusion of the various nations and states into a single body. Once again, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was about to become superfluous. The sunset of these illusions coincided with Lenin's illness and death. All the more serious is the new crisis because of the fact that now, within the Bolshevik Party, an undisputed authority is missing. From the point of view of Trotsky and his allies and followers, there could be no more doubt. The choice of socialism in one country, with the consequent abandonment of the idea of world revolution, was not dictated by political realism and calculation of the relations of force, but only by bureaucratic routine, opportunism, cowardice, and ultimately betrayal. To be hit by this accusation is first and foremost Stalin, who from the beginning had paid particular attention to the national question, aiming for the victory of the revolution at the international level, but first and foremost in Russia. Between February and October 1917, he had presented the proletarian revolution he hoped for as the necessary instrument not only to build a new social order, but also to reaffirm the national independence of Russia. The Entente was trying to force Russia by every means to continue fighting and bleeding itself dry, and was aiming in some way to turn it into a colony of Britain, America, and France. Worse, the Entente behaved in Russia as they would in Central Africa. In this operation, the Mensheviks were accomplices who, with their insistence on the continuation of the war, were bowing to imperialist diktat, were inclined to the gradual bartering away of Russia to foreign capitalists, were leading the country to ruin, and thus had revealed themselves as the true traitors of the nation. In contrast to all this, the revolution to be carried out would not only promote the emancipation of the popular classes, but pave the way for the real emancipation of Russia. After October, the counter-revolution, unleashed by the Whites, supported or aided by the Entente, had been defeated thanks to the appeal of the Bolsheviks to the Russian people to reject the invasion of imperialist powers determined to reduce Russia to a colony or semi colony of the West. It was on this basis that the new Soviet power had also given their support to officials of noble descent. And in promoting this line, Stalin had again distinguished himself and had thus described what was at stake in the course of the Civil War. The victory of Denikin and Kolchak would mean the loss of Russia's independence, would turn her into a milk cow for the British and French plutocrats. In this respect, Denik Kolchak government is a supremely anti-popular, anti-national government. In this respect, the Soviet government is only popular and only national government. In the best sense of these words, because it brings with it not only the emancipation of the working people from capitalism, but also the emancipation of the whole of Russia from the yoke of world imperialism, the conversion of Russia from a colony into an independent and free country. On the battlefields, they faced on the one hand Russian officers who have forgotten Russia, have lost all sense of honor, and are ready to desert to the enemies of workers and peasants Russia. On the other hand were the Red Army soldiers, consciously fighting not to protect capitalist profits, but for the emancipation of Russia. In this perspective, social struggle and national struggle were intertwined. By replacing imperialist unity, unity based on national oppression, with a unity based on the recognition of the principle of equality among nations, the new Soviet Russia would put an end to disintegration and complete ruin, taking place on old Tsarist Russia. On the other hand, by increasing its strength and prestige, the new Soviet Russia would contribute to the weakening of imperialism and to the cause of victory of the revolution in the world. And yet, when the Civil War and the struggle against foreign intervention were at their height, the illusion had spread of rapid expansion of socialism on the wave of the Red Army success, and its advance far beyond the border sanctioned at Brest-Litovsk. Thanks to his realism, and above all to his acute sensitivity to the national question, Stalin had pointed out the dangers of penetrating deep into Polish territory. Quote, "The rear of the Polish forces differs very substantially from that of Kolak and Denkin, to the great advantage of Poland. Unlike the rear of Kolak and Denkin, the rear of Polish forces is homogeneous and nationally united, hence its unity and staunchness. Its predominant sentiment and a sense of motherland is communicated through numerous channels to the Polish front, lending the unit's national cohesion and firmness." End quote. That is to say, it was one thing to defeat an enemy in Russia who was discredited even on a national level, and quite another thing to face a nationally motivated enemy outside Russia. And therefore, the calls for a march on Warsaw and the declarations according to which one could be satisfied only with a great Soviet Warsaw were an expression of vacuous boastfulness and harmful self-conceit. The failure of the attempt to export socialism to Poland, which until some time before had been part of the Tsarist Empire, has strengthened Stalin in his convictions. In 1929, he highlighted the need to take note of a phenomenon largely unsuspected by the protagonists of the October Revolution: the colossal power of stability possessed by nations. They seem destined to be a vital force for long periods of history. And therefore, for a long historical period, humanity would continue to be divided not only between different social systems, but also between different linguistic, cultural, and national identities. What relationship would come to be established between them? In 1936, in an interview with Roy Howard of the Times, Stalin declares, quote, "The idea of exporting revolution is nonsense. Every country, if it wants one, will produce its own revolution. And if it doesn't, there will be no revolution. Thus, for instance, our country wanted to make a revolution and made it." End quote. An outraged Trotsky commented, quote, "Again, we have quoted verbatim from the theory of socialism in a single country. It is a natural transition to that of our revolution in a single country. We more than once announced the duty of the proletariat of countries in which the revolution had conquered to come to the aid of oppressed and insurrectionary classes, and not only with ideas, but if possible, with arms. Nor did we limit ourselves to announcements. We, in our own time, aided the workers of Finland, Latvia, Estonia, and Georgia with armed force. We made an attempt to bring aid to the revolting Polish proletariat by the campaign of the Red Army against Warsaw. End quote. With the prospect for rapid advent of the international Soviet Republic having faded away, and the definitive disappearance of states and national borders, Stalin asserted the principle of peaceful coexistence between countries with different social regimes. But this new principle, which was the result of a learning process and which guaranteed to the Soviet Union the right to independence in a hostile and militarily stronger world, appeared in Trotsky's eyes as a betrayal of proletarian internationalism, as a desertion of the obligations of active mutual solidarity between the oppressed and the exploited of the world. Tireless in his polemic against the transformation of the original internationalist revolutionary policy into a national conservative one against the national pacifist foreign policy of the Soviet government, against the forgetting of the principle according to which the individual worker state must act only as bridgehead of the world revolution. In any case, just as the peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism is unthinkable, a socialist state cannot peacefully merge with a world capitalist system. This is an attitude that Trotsky reiterated again in 1940. It would have been better not to engage in war with Finland, but once it had begun, it should have been carried through to the end, that is, to the Sovietization of Finland.